Miss Marple and Murder on the Frost Coach. And hello, and welcome to another cozy mystery here on Cafe Tales. I'm your host, Ailey, and I'm so glad you've joined us. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from, and how did your day go? Leave a comment and let's share a moment together. Don't forget to subscribe for new stories daily. Now let's start tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. Tickets, Frost, and a late fare. The dawn of that particular Wednesday in midwinter broke with a peculiar crystalline quality that Miss Jane Marple, standing at her cottage window in St. Mary Mead, observed with considerable interest. The frost had come down heavily in the night, transforming every hedge and branch into something that might have been sculpted from spun sugar. It was the sort of morning that made one grateful for woolen, stockings, and a good fire, though Miss Marple had neither the luxury of staying indoors nor the comfort of her own hearth to look forward to for several hours yet. She'd promised her nephew Raymond that she would attend to a small matter of business in London, something to do with the signing of papers that could not, apparently, be accomplished through the post. Young people these days seem to think nothing of expecting their elderly relatives to travel 30 miles on a winter morning. But Miss Marple, who had been up since 5 o'clock, had made her preparations with her usual quiet efficiency. The 6:10 coach from Market Basing to London was not a conveyance that inspired poetry. It was a somewhat battered vehicle that had seen better days, probably before the war, and it possessed all the dubious comforts of its kind: seats that sagged in unexpected places, windows that rattled in their frames, and a heating system that Mr. Wilkes, the driver, defended with the loyalty of a captain defending his ship, despite all evidence that it had long since given up any pretense of warming more than a small circle near the front. Miss Marple, arriving at the stop with 10 minutes to spare, was greeted by the sight of her friend Dolly Bantry, who had insisted on driving her to Market Basing in her own motor car. "Jane, you're quite mad to go up on a day like this," Lady Bantry said, pulling her fur more tightly around her shoulders. "Look at those hedges. We'll all be frozen solid by noon." "Nonsense, Dolly," Miss Marple replied with a slight smile. "The coach is always quite adequate, and Mr. Wilkes takes great pride in keeping to his schedule." "Pride won't warm your feet," Lady Bantry observed darkly. "That floor heater of his is nothing but a noisemaker. I've heard people say it blows cold air more often than hot." Miss Marple acknowledged this with a small inclination of her head. She had, in fact, ridden the 6:10 on several previous occasions and had formed her own conclusions about the heating arrangements. But there was something rather pleasant about the early morning journey, with the frost making patterns on the windows and the gradual lightening of the sky as they approached London. It was a time for quiet observation, and Miss Marple had always found that there was much to be learned from simply watching people go about their ordinary business. The coach arrived precisely on time, wheezing slightly as Mr. Wilkes brought it to a stop. He was a man of perhaps 55, with the weathered face of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors, and he nodded to Miss Marple with the respect due to a regular passenger. "Morning, Miss Marple. Brass monkey weather. Good morning, Mr. Wilkes. I see you have your frost guard in place." "Never without it this time of year," he said with satisfaction. "Engine needs looking after in weather like this." The inside of the coach was already beginning to fog up as Miss Marple climbed aboard. The conductress, a neat woman in her 40s named Mabel Tarrant, greeted her with a smile. "Your usual seat, Miss Marple, though I'm afraid there's not much warmth back there today. That will be quite suitable." "Thank you, Miss Tarrant." Miss Marple settled herself in her accustomed place 3 rows from the back and arranged her bag and her knitting basket beside her. Several other passengers were already aboard. A woman she recognized as Vera Bland, who kept a haberdashery shop in the next village, sat clutching a large parcel wrapped in brown paper and string. Across the aisle, a thin-faced man with a battered sample case stared out the window with the resigned expression of someone who traveled this route too often. Near the front, a stout gentleman in a good overcoat was already making himself comfortable. Miss Marple knew him by sight. Horace Bellamy, who collected rents at the market and was said to do rather well for himself. He had the prosperous look of a man who understood the value of money and made sure to keep a firm grip on it. The coach door opened again, admitting a blast of cold air and a young man carrying a wooden crate. He was dressed in working clothes and had the reddened hands of someone who spent his days handling wet goods. "Morning, Len," Miss Tarrant said. "What have you got there?" "Just an empty, miss," the young man replied. "Taking it back to London. Fish crates, you know. We go through them something awful." Miss Marple noticed that the crate, though described as empty, bore several stenciled markings on its side. Her eyesight was not what it once was, but she could make out what appeared to be a fishmonger stamp and some faded lettering beneath. "You'll need to stow that properly, Len," Miss Tarrant said. "Can't have it blocking the aisle." "Right you are." Len Farrow, for that was the young man's name, set the crate down near the door and took a seat 2 rows back. A few minutes later, just as Mr. Wilkes was preparing to depart, there was a flurry of activity outside. The door opened once more, and a woman in a neat gray coat and hat climbed aboard with quick, precise movements. She was perhaps 40, with a sort of face that suggested both intelligence and a certain rigidity of temperament. "So sorry," she said, though her tone suggested she was not particularly sorry at all. "The bicycle had a puncture." "That's quite all right, Miss Pratt," Miss Tarrant said. "We've only just finished loading." Miss Celia Pratt, schoolmistress, took her ticket and moved down the aisle with the careful steps of someone who disliked disorder. As she passed Len's crate, she paused. "That really shouldn't be there," she observed. "Someone might trip." "Nah, I'll sort it in a moment," Miss Tarrant said. "Better to do it now," Miss Pratt replied. And with a quick movement, she pushed the crate with her foot so that it slid beneath the seat occupied by Horace Bellamy. There, much tidier. Horace, who had been reading his newspaper, looked up briefly and gave a short laugh. "The Frost coach is limbering up," he said to no one in particular. "Everyone finding their places like pieces on a board." Miss Marple, watching from her seat, noted the comment with interest. It was a curious choice of words, though perhaps Mr. Bellamy had not intended anything by it. People often said things that later seemed to carry meanings they had not originally possessed. The coach pulled away from the stop with its characteristic rattle. The windows immediately began to fog more heavily, and passengers settled into that peculiar silence that overtakes people traveling together in the early morning. Outside, the frost-covered hedges slipped past, glittering in the strengthening light. Miss Marple took out her knitting and began to work steadily, her needles clicking with a soft, rhythmic sound. It was going to be a long journey, but she had learned long ago that patience was a virtue, and that one could learn a great deal by simply sitting quietly and observing. And she did not know, of course, that before they reached the first lay-by, one of her fellow passengers would be beyond all need of warmth or observation, but she would remember later every detail of that frost-bound morning. Chapter 2. A Sleeping Man and a Silent Heater. The coach had settled into its steady rhythm. the engine's drone becoming a sort of lullaby that made conversation seem an unnecessary effort. Miss Marple's needles continued their steady work, though she found herself watching the other passengers with the mild, unobtrusive attention that was her particular gift. Vera Bland had unwrapped one corner of her parcel and was examining what appeared to be ribbons of various colors, holding them up to the weak light that filtered through the frosted windows. She made small clicking sounds of approval or disapproval, though whether at the quality of the goods or at something else entirely, it was impossible to say. The commercial traveler, whom Miss Marple had mentally catalogued as Gordon Pike from the name on his sample case, had produced a newspaper and was now hidden behind it. Only his hands were visible, holding the pages with a grip that suggested either intense concentration or a desire not to be disturbed. Horace Bellamy had opened his portfolio and was making notes with a pencil, pausing occasionally to consult what appeared to be a ledger. His lips moved slightly as he calculated, and once or twice he nodded to himself with evident satisfaction. A man who enjoyed his work, Miss Marple thought, or at least enjoyed the profits that came from it. Len Farrow had taken out a thermos and was balancing it on the floor beside his seat. The metal gleamed dully in the gray light, and Miss Marple noticed that he handled it with some care, as though it contained something precious. Tea, most likely, strong and sweet, the way working men liked it. Miss Pratt sat very straight in her seat, a book open on her lap, though her eyes kept straying to the windows and the disordered arrangement of bags and parcels that other passengers had stowed with less precision than she would have preferred. Her gray coat was buttoned to the throat, and she wore gloves of a sensible brown leather that looked both warm and practical. The coach passed through the village where the turnpike began, and Mr. Wilkes paid the toll without slowing more than necessary. The frost was thicker here, away from the shelter of the town, and the hedges looked as though they had been dipped in white paint. Miss Marple found herself thinking of the garden at home and wondering whether her roses would survive. If this weather continued, it was Miss Tarrant who first noticed the change in temperature. She had been moving down the aisle, checking tickets and exchanging pleasantries with the regulars, when she paused and frowned. "Is it my imagination, or has it got colder?" "Always cold on this run," Mr. Pike said, without looking up from his newspaper. "No, I mean really cold, as though the heat has given up entirely." She moved toward the back of the coach and knelt briefly to check the floor grill near Horace Bellamy's seat. After a moment, she stood up, shaking her head. "Nothing coming through here at all. Stone cold it is. That heater never did work properly," Vera Bland observed. "My feet are quite numb." Miss Pratt looked up from her book. "Perhaps Mr. Wilkes could adjust something. It's really most uncomfortable." But Miss Tarrant had already moved on, having apparently decided that complaining about the heating was a futile exercise. She continued her rounds, punching tickets with her small metal device, the clicks marking her progress through the coach. The atmosphere grew heavier as they proceeded. Breath hung in visible clouds, and several passengers pulled their collars higher. Horace Bellamy had abandoned his paperwork and was now leaning back in his seat with his eyes closed, his coat drawn around him like a blanket. His breathing was barely visible in the cold air, just the faintest mist rising from his slightly parted lips. Miss Marple found her attention drawn to him repeatedly, though she could not have said why. There was something about his stillness that seemed different from ordinary sleep, a quality of absolute repose that was almost unsettling. But perhaps that was merely her imagination, colored by the cold and the early hour, and the strange suspended feeling that came from traveling through a landscape transformed by frost. At 6:30, Miss Tarrant made her way to the back seats to mark the monthly tickets, a task that required consulting her notebook and making careful notations. She worked methodically, taking her time, and when she had finished, she remained at the back for several minutes, looking out at the white fields sliding past. Len Farrow rose from his seat and made his way to the front, steadying himself against the seats as the coach swayed. He spoke briefly to Mr. Wilkes, and then the coach slowed and pulled to the side of the road. Both men climbed out, and through the steamed windows, Miss Marple could see them conferring near the bonnet. Mr. Wilkes appeared to be adjusting something, while Len stood by with his hands in his pockets, stamping his feet against the cold. Miss Pratt took advantage of the pause to look around the interior of the coach with evident dissatisfaction. She rose and moved to one of the upper ventilation panels, adjusting it with quick, decisive movements. "There," she said, to no one in particular. "That should help with the condensation." "My head positively aches with all this fog," the two men returned, bringing with them a blast of frigid air that made everyone gasp. Mr. Wilkes resumed his place at the wheel, and the coach lurched forward once more. Len returned to his seat, unscrewing the cap of his thermos and pouring himself a cup of tea that steamed fragrantly in the cold air. It was perhaps 20 minutes later, as they approached the first proper lay-by, that Miss Tarrant made her discovery. She had been moving down the aisle once more, this time to collect fares that were due from passengers who had boarded at intermediate stops. When she reached Horace Bellamy's seat, she paused. "Mr. Bellamy, sir?" There was no response. She touched his shoulder gently, then with more insistence. "Mr. Bellamy, I need to collect your fare for the extra mileage." Still nothing. She looked around at the other passengers, her face showing the first signs of alarm. "He won't wake up," she said. "Mr. Bellamy won't wake up." Gordon Pike lowered his newspaper and regarded the scene with the weary expression of a man who suspects he's about to be drawn into something unpleasant. Vera Bland half rose from her seat, craning her neck to see. "Perhaps he's just sleeping very soundly," she suggested, but Miss Tarrant was already moving to the front of the coach. She spoke urgently to Mr. Wilkes, and the vehicle began to slow. Within moments, they had pulled into the lay-by, a small cleared space beside the road where a farm track led off into the fields. Mr. Wilkes came down the aisle, his boots heavy on the floor. He bent over Horace Bellamy, took one look at his face, and straightened immediately. "We need a doctor," he said quietly. "There's a farm just up that track. They'll have a telephone." A farmer was summoned, a stolid man with a torch, and he agreed to ring for Dr. Haydock at the next village. While they waited, the passengers stood about in small groups, speaking in hushed voices or not at all. The cold seemed to have intensified, though perhaps that was merely because they were no longer moving. Miss Marple remained in her seat, but her eyes moved from face to face, from the white frost on the windows to the floor near Horace Bellamy's feet. Something about that area of the coach seemed wrong, though she could not immediately identify what it was. The floor appeared darker there, as though damp. But when she looked more closely, she saw that it was simply that the surface seemed somehow different. The texture altered. Dr. Haydock arrived within the half hour, a brisk man with sharp eyes and the no-nonsense manner of a country practitioner. He examined Horace Bellamy thoroughly, feeling for a pulse, checking his eyes, placing a hand briefly against his neck. When he straightened, his expression was grave. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done," he said. "The man's dead and has been for some time. A quarter of an hour at least, perhaps longer." There was a collective intake of breath. Vera Bland pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. Miss Pratt's face went very white, though she remained composed. "But how?" Miss Tarrant asked. "There's no mark on him. No sign of anything wrong." Dr. Haydock shook his head. "I can't say with certainty, not without a proper examination, but there's no evidence of violence, no trauma that I can detect. His hands are unmarked. His face shows no signs of distress." He paused, then added, "Could be his heart. These things happen, especially in cold weather." "Heart," someone murmured, as though the word explained everything. But Miss Marple, sitting very still in her seat, was not entirely satisfied with this conclusion. Her eyes had returned to the floor near the dead man's shoes, where the strange coldness seemed to linger. She noticed that Mr. Wilkes, when he had examined the body, had placed his hand briefly on the floor and withdrawn it quickly, as though surprised. "That heater," Miss Marple said quietly to Miss Tarrant, who had returned to her duties with the mechanical movements of shock. "You said it blows nothing. Has it always been so?" Miss Tarrant looked at her blankly for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, miss. That particular grill has never worked properly. Mr. Wilkes complains about it, but nothing seems to fix it." "I see," said Miss Marple. "How very interesting." And she returned to her knitting, though her mind was very far from the pattern she was working. Chapter 3. Miss Marple Notices. A White Burn. The passengers had been invited, or rather instructed, to step outside the coach while Dr. Haydock completed his preliminary examination. It was not a suggestion that anyone was particularly eager to follow, given the biting cold, but there was something in the doctor's manner that discouraged argument. They stood in awkward clusters on the frost-hardened ground, their breath making small clouds in the still air. The farmer, who had lent his telephone, had returned to his work, and the little group was left with nothing to do but wait and speculate in low voices. Miss Marple, however, had not immediately descended. She had risen from her seat and was moving slowly down the aisle, her eyes taking in details with the systematic attention of someone examining a room for the first time. Miss Tarrant, who had remained aboard out of some sense of duty, watched her with a mixture of curiosity and unease. "Terrible thing," the conductress murmured. "And him always so healthy-looking. You never can tell, can you?" "No," Miss Marple agreed softly. "One never can." She had reached the seat where Horace Bellamy's body remained, though Dr. Haydock had covered his face with a coat out of respect. The floor near the seat drew her attention once more, and she bent down with some difficulty to examine it more closely. The carpet in the aisle was worn and stained from years of muddy boots and spilled tea. But in one particular spot, just beside where the dead man's feet had rested, there was a mark quite unlike the others. It was roughly circular, perhaps 3 inches across, and the fibers appeared bleached or burned, though not in any way that suggested fire. The effect was more as though the color had been drawn out of them, leaving a pale, almost white impression. Miss Marple touched it lightly with one gloved finger. The texture felt brittle, frozen almost, though that seemed impossible given that they were indoors, or what passed for indoors in a drafty coach. "Miss Tarrant, has this mark always been here?" The conductress came closer and peered down. "No, miss. At least I don't recall seeing it before. But then I don't often look at the floor that closely unless someone spilled something." Something had indeed been spilled, Miss Marple thought, though perhaps not in the conventional sense. She noticed other small details now that her attention was focused. Tiny granules scattered near the mark, almost like grains of salt or sugar. except that when she touched one, it seemed to vanish. Dissolving into a faint mist against the warmth of her glove, a spent match lay nearby, its head blackened as though it had been struck. She picked it up carefully and examined it. The tip was damp, which was odd. One did not usually strike a match and have it go out immediately, unless the air itself refused to sustain the flame. Her gaze traveled to Horace Bellamy's trousers, visible beneath the coat that covered him. There, along the hem, was another peculiarity, a pale rim, as though the fabric had been exposed to something that had drawn the warmth and color from the wool. It was the sort of mark one might see on clothing left out overnight in a heavy frost, except more concentrated. More deliberate, most interesting, she said, almost to herself. Dr. Haydock had finished his initial examination and was making notes in a small book he carried. He glanced up as Miss Marple straightened with some effort. "Nothing more to be learned here," he said. "The authorities will need to be notified. Of course, Inspector Slack will want to see everything exactly as it is." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed. "Though I wonder, Doctor, if you notice the floor, just here, where it seems so very cold." Dr. Haydock frowned and knelt down, placing his hand flat on the carpet. He held it there for several seconds, then moved it a few inches away and repeated the action. His expression grew more thoughtful. "You're quite right. It's considerably colder in this specific area, almost as though something frozen had been resting here." He looked up at the floor grill beneath the seat. "That heater has never worked properly, I understand, but this is more than simple mechanical failure. The floor is actively cold, not merely lacking warmth." Miss Marple had taken a small coin from her purse, one of the old pennies that she kept for various small purposes. She placed it on the floor near the edge of the white mark and gave it a gentle push. The coin rolled forward, wobbling slightly, and then seemed to slow and stop, as though it had encountered an invisible barrier or depression. "How very curious," she said. "One would expect it to roll straight given the slight incline of the aisle." She repeated the experiment at another location, further from the dead man's seat. This time, the coin rolled smoothly and predictably, coming to rest several feet away, exactly as one would expect. Miss Tarrant watched these proceedings with growing bewilderment. "I don't understand, miss. What does a rolling coin tell us?" "Perhaps nothing," Miss Marple said gently. "Or perhaps a great deal. It suggests that the air near the floor in this particular spot behaves differently than elsewhere, almost as though there were a puddle of something. Though not water." She caught Dr. Haydock's eye, and something passed between them, an understanding that did not require words. The doctor nodded slowly. "A puddle of air," he said, "or rather a different sort of air, heavier, perhaps, than what surrounds it. That would explain the coin's behavior and the extreme cold." Before Miss Marple could respond, there was a commotion outside. Mr. Wilkes had apparently sent word ahead, and Inspector Slack had arrived with remarkable speed, driven by one of his constables. He came aboard the coach like a small tempest, his face already set in the expression of profound irritation that seemed to be his natural state. "Right then," he said, looking around at the interior of the coach as though it had personally offended him. "I understand we have a sudden death. Natural causes, I'm told." "That remains to be determined," Dr. Haydock said carefully. "There are some unusual features that may require investigation." Inspector Slack's eyes narrowed. "Unusual features? I don't like the sound of that." His gaze fell on Miss Marple, and his expression became, if possible, even more sour. "And I see we have our local expert on hand. I suppose you've already solved the whole business, Miss Marple, and are just waiting to enlighten us all." "Not at all, Inspector. Miss Marple said mildly. "I have merely observed one or two small details that seem out of place. The white mark on the carpet, for instance, and the peculiar coldness of the floor, also this match, which appears to have been struck but failed to burn properly." She held out the match head on her gloved palm. Inspector Slack took it with the air of a man accepting something he would rather not touch. "A match," he said flatly. "And that tells us what exactly?" "Perhaps that the air near the floor would not support a flame," Miss Marple suggested. "Which is rather unusual, don't you think?" "Air generally contains enough oxygen for such purposes." Inspector Slack opened his mouth, closed it again, and then turned to Dr. Haydock with a look that demanded explanation. The doctor shrugged. "Miss Marple may be on to something. The evidence suggests that conditions near the floor in this specific location were significantly different from the rest of the coach. How or why, I cannot yet say." The inspector sighed heavily, the sound of a man who recognized that his day was about to become considerably more complicated than he had anticipated. "Very well," he said. "We'll do this properly. No one is to leave until I've taken statements from everyone, and someone had better fetch Lady Bantry. If Miss Marple is involved, her friend usually follows like a shadow." Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes returned to the white burn on the carpet and to the pale rim on the dead man's trouser hem. Somewhere in these small details lay the answer to how Horace Bellamy had died on a cold winter morning, surrounded by people, yet utterly alone in his final moments. Chapter 4. The Grill That Blew No Steam. Lady Bantry arrived within the hour, having been fetched from Market Basing, where she had been taking tea at the Red Lion while waiting for news of her friend's safe arrival in London. She descended from the constable's motor car with the air of someone who had been expecting drama and was not in the least disappointed to find it. Jane, "I knew something would happen," she announced, sweeping into the coach with her usual energy. "You simply cannot travel anywhere without stumbling over a body. It's a positive gift." "Hardly a gift one would wish for," Miss Marple murmured, though there was the faintest suggestion of amusement in her eyes. Inspector Slack had organized the passengers into groups, separating them so that their accounts of the morning's events would not be influenced by overhearing one another. Gordon Pike had been dispatched to sit in the farmer's barn, looking more resigned than distressed. Vera Bland had been allowed to remain in the coach, but had been moved to the front seats, where she sat clutching her parcel of ribbons. Miss Pratt had been asked to wait outside and could be seen through the window, standing very straight and still, her gloved hands clasped before her. Len Farrow had been questioned first, his statement taken with methodical thoroughness by the inspector. Now he sat on the running board of the coach, his thermos beside him. Looking both worried and bewildered, Miss Marple had returned her attention to the floor grill, beneath seat 7B. It was a standard fitting, perhaps 8 inches square, with a mesh screen designed to allow warm air from the heating system to circulate through the coach. She had asked Mr. Wilkes to explain the arrangement, and he had done so with the patient air of a man who had discussed this particular mechanical failure many times before. "The water heater runs along the underside," he had explained, pointing to the general area beneath the floor. "Steam's supposed to rise through these grills and warm the interior, but that particular one hasn't worked right for 2 seasons at least. Blows cold if it blows anything at all. Now," Miss Marple knelt beside it, her joints protesting slightly at the position, and examined the grill more closely. Lady Bantry hovered nearby, full of questions that she managed with visible effort to suppress. The mesh itself was clean, or as clean as one could expect in a vehicle that carried muddy boots and market goods. But when Miss Marple laid her gloved hand against it, she found it not merely cool, but positively cold, as though it had been packed in ice. The sensation was startling enough that she withdrew her hand quickly. "Dr. Haydock," she called softly, "would you confirm something for me?" The doctor came over and repeated her action, pressing his palm flat against the grill. His eyebrows rose. "Good Lord, that's not just lack of heat. That's active cold, as though something refrigerated had been pressed against the other side." Miss Marple reached down and lifted the valance that hung. From the seat above, the fabric meant to hide the mechanical workings beneath. In the dim space revealed, she could see the pipes and fittings of the heating system, and wedged behind the grill mesh itself was a thin piece of card. "Waxy to the touch. How very interesting," she said, working it free with careful fingers. "Someone has created a baffle, blocking the flow of air entirely. Not warm air and not cold, just stillness." Inspector Slack had been conducting his interviews at the front of the coach, but he came back now, drawn by the interest in Miss Marple's discovery. "What's that you found?" Miss Marple held up the waxed card. It had been cut precisely to fit behind the grill, and one side bore a faint, greasy residue that suggested it had been handled with some care. "A deliberate obstruction," she said. "Someone wanted this particular vent to blow neither warm nor cold air, but rather to allow something else to remain undisturbed at floor level." "Something else?" Slack's voice was sharp. "What something else?" Before Miss Marple could answer, Miss Tarrant spoke up from her position near the front. She had been listening with growing agitation. "I sometimes tidy parcels under the seats," she admitted, her face flushed. "When the aisle gets crowded, you understand. It's my job to keep things orderly. I might have kicked something under there without thinking." "That's quite understandable," Miss Marple said gently. "And this morning, when the late passenger boarded, someone moved Len's crate from beside the door." "Do you recall who?" Miss Tarrant hesitated. "It was Miss Pratt, I think." "Yes, definitely Miss Pratt. She said it shouldn't be blocking the way and pushed it under Mr. Bellamy's seat, Lady Bantry." Who had been examining the crate in question, where it now sat against the wall of the coach, called out, "Jane, come look at this." "The bottom has frost on it. Not much, but definite frost, as though something very cold had been inside." Inspector Slack's expression had progressed from irritation to genuine interest. He moved to examine the crate himself, running his fingers along the interior surface. "Len Farrow, you said this crate was empty. What did it hold before?" Len scrambled to his feet, his face anxious. "Just fish, sir. We pack them in ice for transport. Sometimes dry ice if they're going a long way. Keeps them from spoiling. Dry ice." Dr. Haydock spoke the word slowly, as though testing its weight. "Solid carbon dioxide. It sublimes directly from solid to gas, leaving no liquid residue, and the gas is heavier than air, so it would sink and pool at floor level." Miss Marple nodded. "And if someone were to place a block of dry ice beneath this seat, behind a blocked grill that would not allow rising warm air to disperse it, the gas would accumulate in a layer along the floor. A man sitting low in his seat with his collar up against the cold might breathe nothing but carbon dioxide for quite some time before anyone noticed." The silence that followed this observation was profound. Even Inspector Slack seemed momentarily robbed of speech. "But that would mean," Lady Bantry said, her voice barely above a whisper, "that this wasn't natural causes at all. Someone deliberately suffocated that poor man with invisible gas. I believe that is exactly what happened, Miss Marple said quietly. The white burn on the carpet where the dry ice rested. The match that would not stay lit because there was insufficient oxygen. The extreme cold at floor level. And this wax card, placed deliberately to prevent any air circulation that might have saved Mr. Bellamy's life. Inspector Slack had recovered his composure. This changes everything. We're looking at murder, deliberate and planned, and it was someone on this coach who did it. His gaze swept across the passengers with new suspicion. Someone who knew about dry ice and had access to it. Someone who could move that crate into position without attracting notice. Miss Marple folded her hands across her knitting bag. Someone who understood science, perhaps. Someone methodical and precise, and someone who had a very good reason to want Horace Bellamy dead. But who? Lady Bantry demanded. And how on earth are we going to prove it? Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. By examining what people did during the journey, and more importantly, what they had the opportunity to do, and by paying attention to the small things that people often overlook, a label on a crate, for instance, or the particular skills and knowledge that different individuals possess. She looked down at the waxed card in her hand, turning it over slowly. Somewhere in the tangle of movements and opportunities and hidden motives lay the answer. It was simply a matter of patience and observation, and patience, as Miss Marple had learned over many years in St. Mary Mead, was something she had in abundance. Chapter 5. 2 Labels for 1 Crate. The revelation that they were dealing with murder rather than misfortune had cast a different light over the entire company. What had been sympathy and shock now transformed into weariness and suspicion. Each passenger regarded the others with new eyes, wondering which among them had possessed both the knowledge and the cold deliberation to commit such an act. Inspector Slack had taken command of the investigation with his characteristic brusqueness, ordering that nothing be moved or disturbed until he had completed a thorough examination. He had dispatched his constable to telephone for additional assistance and to make inquiries at the fishmonger's establishment about their use of dry ice. Miss Tarrant, her earlier composure badly shaken, had produced her way-bill at the inspector's request. It was a much-handled document, stained with tea and marked with her neat handwriting, recording the various parcels and packages that had been loaded at different stops along the route. "Here," she said, pointing to an entry near the bottom. "That's Len's crate, loaded at market basing at 612, marked as empty return goods." But Miss Marple, who had moved closer to examine both the way-bill and the crate itself, had noticed something that made her pause. The crate bore 2 labels, one affixed over the other. The upper label was fresh and clearly written, designating market basing as the point of origin. The lower label, partially torn but still partially visible at the edges, told a different story. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe you should examine this more closely." Slack came over with ill-concealed impatience, but his expression changed as Miss Marple carefully peeled back the corner of the upper label to reveal what lay beneath. The lower label was older, more weathered, and bore the printed heading, "Benham Fish," in bold letters. Below that, in smaller type that had faded but was still legible, were the words, "Refrigerant contents. Handle with gloves." "Benham," Inspector Slack said slowly. "That's 15 miles south of here. And this marking about refrigerant would suggest the crate held dry ice at some point. Len Farrow had been brought back into the coach at this point, and he stared at the labels with genuine bewilderment. "But that's not right, sir," That crate was empty when I picked it up this morning. My governor sent me to collect empties from the market basing depot. We send dry ice sometimes for eels and such, like I said, but this one was just an empty return. And yet it bears a label from Benham Fish, Miss Marple observed gently, which would suggest it came from there originally, perhaps containing dry ice, and was then relabeled for return through market basing. Vera Bland, who had been sitting in silence at the front of the coach, suddenly spoke up. There was something odd about that label. The upper one, I mean. When Miss Pratt moved the crate, I noticed the writing looked fresh, as though someone had written it recently, perhaps even that morning. Inspector Slack examined the upper label more carefully. "Blue pencil," he muttered, "and the handwriting is quite different from the printed portion. Someone has altered the delivery time." He looked up sharply. "Who handles this sort of paperwork? Who would have access to blank labels?" Miss Tarrant shook her head helplessly. "Anyone, really. We keep them in a box at the depot. People label their own parcels all the time. Miss Marple had moved to where Horace Bellamy's belongings had been carefully set aside by Dr. Haydock. His portfolio, thick with papers and receipts, lay open on an adjacent seat. She examined its contents with the meticulous care of someone looking for a very specific thing. "Inspector, may I?" Slack waved his hand in grudging permission, and Miss Marple carefully lifted papers one by one, holding them to the light that filtered through the frosted windows. In the leather flap of the portfolio, caught in a small tear, was a tiny flake of something white. She extracted it carefully and held it on her gloved palm. "What is that?" Lady Bantry asked, peering over her friend's shoulder. "It looks like paper, but it's vanishing." "Hold your breath near it," Miss Marple suggested. Lady Bantry did so, her warm exhalation causing the small fragment to dissolve into vapor almost instantly. "Dry ice," Dr. Haydock confirmed. "A fragment must have caught in the portfolio somehow, perhaps when it was near the crate, or when Mr. Bellamy leaned down to adjust something." Miss Marple's expression had grown very thoughtful. "Or perhaps someone placed something in his portfolio while speaking to him, a distraction while the real work was being done beneath his seat." Inspector Slack had been making notes in his pocketbook, his pencil moving rapidly. "Right then, we need to establish who had both opportunity and knowledge. Len Farrow, you work with fish and would know about dry ice. What's your connection to the deceased?" Len's face had gone pale. "None, sir. I never spoke to Mr. Bellamy before this morning. Just knew him by sight from the markets. And yet the murder weapon came in your crate," Slack pointed out grimly. "But anyone could have put something in it," Len protested. "It was sitting by the door for several minutes before Miss Pratt moved it. And like I said, it was empty when I loaded it." Miss Pratt had been brought back into the coach at this point, her composure intact, but her eyes watchful. When shown the labels, she examined them with the careful attention of someone accustomed to precision. "Yes, I moved the crate," she acknowledged. It was blocking the aisle, which seemed both inefficient and potentially dangerous. "I simply pushed it with my foot to a more suitable location." "Under Mr. Bellamy's seat specifically," Inspector Slack said. "Why that particular spot?" "It was the nearest empty space large enough to accommodate it," Miss Pratt replied evenly. "I saw no reason to carry it the length of the coach when a perfectly adequate location was immediately available." Miss Marple had returned to examining the waybill, her finger tracing down the entries. "Miss Tarrant, I notice you have recorded several parcels and packages. This one here, marked as ribbons and notions from Vera Bland. And here, Gordon Pike's sample case. But I don't see an entry for any parcel belonging to Miss Pratt." Miss Tarrant consulted her records, then shook her head. No, Miss Pratt travels light as a rule, just her satchel with her books and papers. I see, Miss Marple said softly. And yet earlier, before we departed, I could have sworn I saw you carrying something wrapped in paper. Or perhaps my memory is failing me. Miss Pratt's composure flickered just for an instant. You must be mistaken. I carried only my usual things, but Vera Bland spoke up again, her voice hesitant. No, Miss Marple is right. I saw it too. You had a small parcel when you boarded Miss Pratt, wrapped in brown paper. I remember because the wrapping was the same kind we use in my shop, and I thought it odd that you should have anything from a haberdashery. I think, Miss Marple said gently, that we shall find that parcel had nothing to do with ribbons or notions. And I suspect the blue pencil used to alter the crate. Label will prove to be a very particular shade, the sort used by school teachers for marking papers. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind whistling through the gaps around the coach doors and the distant call of a crow from the frozen fields beyond. Chapter 6. Alibis by Laby Thermos and Ticket Punch. Inspector Slack had produced a notebook and was now constructing a timeline with the grim determination of a man who refused to be confounded by invisible gases and clever misdirection. He had arranged the passengers in chronological order according to their boarding times, and was methodically extracting from each person an account of their movements during the critical period. The death occurred sometime between 6:10, when we departed market basing, and 7:05, when the body was discovered, he announced. Dr. Haydock estimates the actual moment of death at approximately 6:50, give or take 10 minutes. During that window, someone placed dry ice beneath Mr. Bellamy's seat and ensured it would do its deadly work undisturbed. He consulted his notes. Mr. Wilkes, you were at the wheel throughout. Did you leave your position at any point? The driver scratched his chin thoughtfully. Only once, sir. At 6:48, as I recall, the frost guard on the radiator needed adjusting. I pulled over briefly, no more than 3 or 4 minutes. Len Farrow came out to have a smoke, and we stood by the bonnet together. So you can vouch for Farrow's whereabouts during those minutes? Aye, sir. He was in plain sight the whole time, stamping his feet and complaining about the cold. Len nodded vigorously. That's right, sir. And before that, I was sitting in my seat, 2 rows back from the crate. Didn't go near it after I loaded it at market basing. Inspector Slack made a notation. Miss Tarrant, where were you during this period? The conductress had regained some of her composure, though her hand still trembled slightly as she consulted her own records. I was punching tickets at the front from about 6:15 to 6:30. Then I moved toward the back to mark the monthly passes. That would have been 6:45 to 6:55. I remember checking my watch because I pride myself on keeping to schedule. And you were at the back of the coach during the estimated time of death? Yes, sir. Working on the monthly tickets. It takes time to do them properly, with all the notations required. Miss Marple spoke quietly from her position near the window. So you would not have seen anyone moving about in the middle section of the coach during that critical 10 minutes? Miss Tarrant's face fell. No, miss. I wouldn't have. I was quite absorbed in my work. Inspector Slack turned his attention to Gordon Pike, who had been brought back from his exile in the barn. The commercial traveler looked thoroughly miserable, his sample case clutched defensively against his chest. Mr. Pike, what were your movements? Pike shrugged uncomfortably. I stayed in my seat, sir, reading my newspaper. I'm not one for conversation on these early runs. Prefer to keep to myself. Did you notice anyone moving about? Not particularly. I was behind the paper, you see. Could have been activity all around me, and I wouldn't have paid it much mind." "Convenient," Slack observed dryly. "Miss Bland, you're next." Vera Bland clutched her parcel of ribbons more tightly. "I remained in my seat the entire time, Inspector. I was examining my purchases, you see, checking the quality of the goods. I'm very particular about what I stock in my shop. Did you observe Miss Pratt during this period?" Vera hesitated. "I saw her get up once. It must have been around 6:40, because I remember thinking it was rather close to when Miss Tarrant would be collecting the monthly fares." Miss Pratt went forward and adjusted one of the ventilation panels. She said something about the condensation giving her a headache. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with interest. "The ventilation panel above Mr. Bellamy's seat, by any chance?" "Yes, I believe it was." She complained about drafts, but then she opened the panel rather than closing it. "I thought that odd at the time." Inspector Slack made another note, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Pratt, you acknowledge this?" The schoolmistress inclined her head slightly. "I do." The air in the coach was becoming quite oppressive with all the moisture from people's breath. "I simply opened the top ventilation to improve circulation. It's basic science. Warm air rises and an outlet at the top allows proper flow. Or," Miss Marple suggested gently, "it allows any gas that might be rising from floor level to escape before it reaches the breathing zone of other passengers. Carbon dioxide, while heavier than air, will eventually disperse if given sufficient ventilation above." Miss Pratt's lips thinned, but she said nothing. Inspector Slack had moved on to examining the physical evidence more carefully. Len Farrow's thermos had been set aside with the other items, collected from the scene, and Miss Marple had noticed something about it that now seemed significant. "Inspector, might I examine that thermos?" Slack handed it over, and Miss Marple studied the metal lid with close attention. There was a faint ring on its surface, barely visible, but distinct when held at the right angle to the light. The mark suggested that something very cold had rested against it, leaving a pattern of condensed moisture that had since frozen. "Len, where did you place your thermos when you boarded?" "On the floor beside my seat, miss, same as always. Keeps it steady during the journey." "And it remained there throughout?" "Yes, miss, except when I poured myself a cup during the stop, but that was after Mr. Wilkes and I came back inside." Miss Marple turned the lid in her hands. "This frosting suggests that something extremely cold was placed against the thermos at some point. Not merely cold air, but direct contact with something approaching the temperature of dry ice." Lady Bantry leaned in to look. "Could someone have used the thermos to transport the dry ice without anyone noticing?" "No," Miss Marple said. "The interior would show signs of such extreme cold," and Len poured tea from it without difficulty. "But someone might have set a piece of dry ice down beside the thermos briefly while preparing to place it under the seat, perhaps to free their hands for a moment." Inspector Slack's expression had grown increasingly grim. "Miss Pratt, I'm going to ask you directly. Did you purchase dry ice from Benham Fish yesterday or the day before?" Miss Pratt remained silent for a long moment, her gloved hands clasped tightly together. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. "I fail to see how such a question is relevant to Mr. Bellamy's unfortunate death." "It's relevant because I believe you did purchase it," Inspector Slack said. "And I believe you brought it aboard this coach with the express purpose of using it as a murder weapon. The question is not whether you had the means and opportunity, Miss Pratt. The question is, why? What could drive a respectable schoolmistress to commit such a calculated act?" The wind had picked up outside, rattling the windows of the coach and sending small eddies of frost crystals across the frozen ground. Inside, the silence stretched taut as a violin string, waiting for someone to speak the words that would break the case wide open. Miss Marple sat very still, her knitting forgotten in her lap, watching Miss Pratt's face with the patient attention of someone who had seen this particular expression before in other contexts, in other troubled souls backed into corners of their own making. Chapter 7. A Coin That Wouldn't Roll. The tension in the coach had become almost palpable, but Miss Marple appeared untroubled by it. She had returned to her small experiment with the coin, this time conducting it with more deliberation and inviting the others to observe. "I should like to demonstrate something," she said, addressing the assembled company with the mild manner of a teacher presenting a lesson to attentive pupils. "If you would all watch carefully." She placed her penny on the floor near the back of the coach and gave it a gentle push. It rolled smoothly and predictably, traveling several feet before coming to rest against the base of a seat. "Quite ordinary," she observed. "Now, let us try the same experiment near Mr. Bellamy's former position." She moved forward and placed the coin on the floor adjacent to seat 7B, in the area where the white burn still marked the carpet. When she pushed it with the same gentle force, the coin behaved quite differently. It rolled forward perhaps 6 inches, then seemed to lose momentum, wobbling slightly before stopping altogether. It was as though it had encountered an invisible barrier, or had rolled into a depression that halted its progress. Dr. Haydock, who had been watching with professional interest, knelt down and struck a match near the floor. The flame flickered and immediately went out, as though starved of oxygen. "A puddle of air," Miss Marple repeated her earlier phrase. "Or rather, a puddle of carbon dioxide that still lingers even now, hours after the ice itself has sublimed away completely. The gas, being heavier than ordinary air, pools and stays low to the ground." Lady Bantry shuddered dramatically. "How perfectly horrid, to think of that invisible poison just sitting there waiting." "Not poison in the conventional sense," Dr. Haydock corrected. "Carbon dioxide is present in the air we all breathe in small quantities, but in concentration it displaces oxygen and causes suffocation. A person sitting low, as Mr. Bellamy was, with his collar buttoned against the cold, would have breathed nothing but carbon dioxide for several minutes. He would have grown drowsy, then unconscious, then ceased breathing altogether, all without a struggle or any outward sign of distress. Inspector Slack had been examining Miss Pratt with barely concealed suspicion throughout this demonstration. Now he addressed her directly once more. "Miss Pratt, I note that you were wearing a knitted muff. May I examine it?" The schoolmistress hesitated, then slowly removed the muff from her hands and passed it to the inspector. It was a neat piece of work, tightly knitted in gray wool, with a practical design that suggested warmth rather than fashion. Slack turned it over in his hands, then held it up to the light. On the outer surface, barely visible against the gray wool, were tiny white speckles, like frozen dew or the residue of sublimed frost. "What are these marks, Miss Pratt?" "I'm sure I don't know," she replied, but her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "Perhaps moisture from the condensation in the coach." Miss Marple reached out and touched one of the speckles gently with her gloved finger. It dissolved instantly, leaving a faint dampness. "Not moisture," she said quietly. "Or at least not ordinary moisture. This is the residue of sublimed carbon dioxide, the same substance we found on the carpet and in Mr. Bellamy's portfolio." It clings to fabric that has been in close proximity to dry ice. And your gloves, Inspector Slack continued, his voice taking on the relentless quality of a hound closing in on its quarry. May I examine those as well? Miss Pratt removed her gloves with stiff mechanical movements. They were practical brown leather, well worn but carefully maintained. Inspector Slack raised them to his nose and sniffed carefully. Paraffin or something very like it. The sort of waxy substance one might find on treated card or paper. Miss Marple nodded. The baffle that was placed behind the grill was made of waxed card, designed to resist moisture while blocking airflow. Anyone handling it would likely transfer some of that waxy residue to their gloves. Lady Bantry, who had been following these revelations with increasing dismay, spoke up suddenly. But Jane, why? Why would Miss Pratt want to harm Mr. Bellamy? What possible reason could she have? It was the question that had hung unspoken in the air throughout the investigation, and now it demanded an answer. Inspector Slack turned to face the schoolmistress directly. Yes, Miss Pratt. I believe we've established beyond reasonable doubt that you had both the means and the opportunity. What we lack is the motive. Why did you kill Horace Bellamy? For a long moment, Miss Pratt said nothing. She stood very straight, her face pale but composed, her hands clasped before her in the absence of her gloves and muff. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. Mr. Bellamy was a man who collected things, rents, of course, from the market stall holders, but also debts, small obligations that people incurred and could not easily repay. He was very patient about it, very understanding, but he never forgot, and he never forgave. Go on, Inspector Slack said. I supplement my teaching salary with private tutoring, Miss Pratt continued. It's not forbidden precisely, but it must be declared and approved by the school board. Several years ago, I neglected to seek that approval. The amounts were small and it seemed unnecessary paperwork, but it was technically a violation of my employment terms. And Bellamy discovered this, Miss Marple said gently. Yes, I don't know how, but he had proof, documents showing payments I'd received. He came to me 3 weeks ago and made his position clear. I could either pay him a regular sum to ensure his silence, or he would report me to the school board. I would lose my position, my pension, everything I've worked for over 20 years. The words came more quickly now, as though a dam had broken. He called it insurance, a small investment in my continued employment. But it wasn't small, not on a teacher's salary, and it would never end. I saw that clearly. He would bleed me dry over the years, always polite, always reasonable, always implacable. She looked around at the faces watching her, and for the first time her composure truly cracked. I couldn't bear it. The thought of being in his power for the rest of my working life, of having to smile and pay and pretend gratitude for his discretion. So yes, I decided to stop him. I learned about dry ice from my science textbooks. I visited Venom Fish and made inquiries, claiming I needed it for a school demonstration. I prepared everything carefully, and when I saw Len's crate this morning, I knew it was the perfect opportunity. Inspector Slack's expression was grim. You do realize that what you've just described is premeditated murder? I realize it, Miss Pratt said quietly. I've realized it every moment since. But, Inspector, I was drowning. Mr. Bellamy had his hand on my throat just as surely as if he'd strangled me with a cord. I only wanted to breathe freely again. I only wanted my life back. Miss Marple had been silent throughout this confession, but now she spoke, her voice carrying a weight of sadness. There are always other choices, my dear. The law, for instance, a solicitor. Even the school board itself might have been more understanding than you imagined. Perhaps, Miss Pratt said, but I didn't see them then. I only saw one way forward, and I took it. The wind rattled the windows. Again, and somewhere in the distance, a crow called mournfully across the frozen fields. Chapter 8. The Fishmonger's Stamp, Miss Pratt's. Confession, while damning left. Inspector Slack with the professional obligation to verify every detail. A confession alone, particularly one given under emotional duress, was not always reliable. Evidence must corroborate, witnesses must confirm, and loose ends must be tied with the precision that would satisfy a magistrate. "We'll need to visit Benham Fish," he announced, closing his notebook with a decisive snap. "If Miss Pratt's account is accurate, someone there will remember her inquiries about dry ice. Constable Richards, you'll accompany Miss Pratt to the station and ensure she's made comfortable. Dr. Haydock, I'll need your formal report by this evening." Miss Marple, who had been sitting quietly throughout the confession, now spoke up. "Inspector, if you're going to Benham, I should very much like to accompany you. I have one or two questions that might prove illuminating." Slack looked as though he might refuse, but Lady Bantry intervened with characteristic firmness. "Really, Inspector? Miss Marple has done more to solve this case than anyone. The least you can do is allow her to see it through properly." The inspector capitulated. With poor grace, and within the hour, a small party set off for Benham in the constable's motor car. The frost had not lifted despite the advancing day, and the hedges still glittered with their coating of crystalline. White Benham Fish occupied a low building near the railway goods yard, with a large cold storage facility attached. The smell of the sea hung about the place, though they were miles inland, and crates similar to Len's stood stacked near the loading bay. The manager, a stout man named Drummond, received them with the wary courtesy of someone who suspects official business never brings good news. When Inspector Slack explained their purpose, his expression shifted from weariness to frank surprise. "A schoolmistress, you say?" "Yes, I remember her. Tuesday morning it was, or possibly Monday. She came in asking about dry ice for a science demonstration. Wanted to know how long a block would last and how to handle it safely." "Did she purchase any?" Slack asked. 2 blocks, standard size, paid cash, and took them wrapped in newspaper. I remember thinking it was unusual for a school to send a teacher rather than having it delivered, but she said she was passing by anyway, and it would save the delivery charge. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Drummond, did she ask any specific questions about the properties of the ice?" "Anything beyond simple handling instructions?" Drummond scratched his head, thinking back. "Now that you mention it, yes. She asked particularly about how the gas behaves when it sublimes, whether it rises or falls, how long it stays concentrated in a confined space, that sort of thing." Scientific questions, which made sense given she was a teacher. "And did she ask about storage?" "About keeping it under a seat, perhaps." The manager's eyes widened. "How did you know that?" "Yes, she did ask about whether it would last overnight if kept in a small space with limited air circulation. Said something about wanting to demonstrate sublimation to her students the next morning without the block melting away beforehand, Inspector." Slack made careful notes while Miss Marple continued her gentle questioning. "I don't suppose you noticed what she was wearing, whether she had gloves. For instance, brown leather gloves," Drummond said promptly. "I noticed because when she handled the wrapped ice, I warned her to keep her gloves on. Dry ice can burn skin something fierce if you touch it directly. She seemed to know that already, though." They moved on to examine the storage facility and the types of crates used for shipping. The wooden boxes were indeed identical to the one Len had carried aboard the coach, and each bore the stamped marking, Benham Fish. With the warning about refrigerant contents, we send these all over, Drummond explained. Eels mostly, sometimes other delicate fish that need to stay frozen during transport. The crates go out full and come back empty. Then we reuse them. Save on costs that way. And the labels, Miss Marple inquired. Who applies those? Customers usually do it themselves or our dispatch clerks. We keep blank labels in a box by the door for anyone who needs them. Makes things simpler. Miss Marple examined the box of labels, noting their familiar appearance. They were identical to the upper label on Len's crate, the one that had been written in blue pencil with Market Basing as the destination. Inspector Slack had one more question. Did anyone else purchase dry ice around the same time? A commercial traveler, perhaps, or a young fisher? Drummond consulted his ledger, running his finger down the entries. No commercial travelers that week. We had the schoolmistress on Tuesday, a restaurant order on Wednesday, and a medical facility on Thursday. No one matching the description of a fishmonger or a traveling salesman. This effectively eliminated Gordon Pike from suspicion, if any had remained. He had claimed to know nothing about dry ice, and the record supported his assertion. On the journey back, Miss Marple was thoughtful. Lady Bantry, who had insisted on coming along despite the cold, could contain her curiosity no longer. What are you thinking, Jane? Surely the case is solved. Miss Pratt confessed, and Mr. Drummond's testimony confirmed she purchased the dry ice and asked very specific questions about its properties. Oh, the case is quite solved, Miss Marple agreed. I was merely reflecting on how knowledge can be turned to such dark purposes. Miss Pratt's education, her scientific understanding, all the things that should have made her an asset to her community were instead employed in planning a murder. It's rather sad, really. Sad. Inspector Slack snorted from the front seat. She killed a man in cold blood, if you'll pardon the expression, planned it carefully, executed it cleverly, and would have gotten away with it if not for your sharp eyes and that business with the coin. Nevertheless, Miss Marple said quietly, I cannot help but feel pity. She was a woman in desperate circumstances, driven to desperate measures by a man who preyed upon those weaker than himself. I'm not excusing what she did, Inspector. Murder is murder, and must be answered for, but I understand why she felt cornered. They drove on through the frost-bound landscape, each occupied with their own thoughts. The coach stood empty now in the lay-by, waiting to be released by the authorities and return to service. By tomorrow it would be carrying passengers again, the frost would melt, and the ordinary business of life would resume. But Miss Marple knew that for Miss Pratt there would be no return to ordinary life. The choices made on a cold winter, morning had set her on a path from which there was no turning back, and all the careful planning in the world could not change that. Fundamental truth. In her handbag, carefully, wrapped in a handkerchief, Miss Marple carried the spent match she'd found by Horace Bellamy's feet. She would keep it, she thought, as a reminder that sometimes the smallest clues reveal the largest crimes, and that observation and patience were worth more than all the clever theories in the world. Chapter 9. A parcel tag written twice. The return to the lay-by found the scene much as they had left, though the constable, who had remained behind, reported that the other passengers had grown increasingly restless. Vera Bland had complained of missing her appointments in London, and Gordon Pike had asked repeatedly when he might be released to continue his journey. Only Len Farrow seemed resigned to the delay, sitting on the running board with his empty thermos and watching the frozen fields with the patience of a man accustomed to waiting. Inspector Slack called them all back into the coach for what he termed a final accounting. The heating system had been coaxed back to life by Mr. Wilkes, and the interior was almost warm, though the windows remained frosted at the edges. "Before I release you all," Slack began, "I want to make certain we have a complete picture of what occurred this morning. Miss Pratt has confessed to the murder of Horace Bellamy, and we have corroborating evidence from Benham Fish. However, there remain some practical details to establish for the court proceedings." He turned to Len Farrow first. "The crate you brought aboard was genuinely empty when you collected it from market basing." "Yes, sir," Len affirmed. "I picked up 3 empties from the depot, and that was one of them. Clean as a whistle inside, or near enough. Yet it bore a label from Benham Fish beneath the market basing tag." "Can you explain that?" Len shrugged. "Crates make the rounds, sir. One day they're going to London full of eels. Next day they're coming back empty through market basing. We don't scrape off every old label. Just put a new one over it when we redirect them." Miss Marple had been examining the debris that had accumulated in the coach during the morning's activities. Various papers had been collected and set aside by the constable: ticket stubs, a newspaper, a crumpled handkerchief, and several small scraps that appeared to have fallen from pockets or bags. Among these she found what she was seeking: the lower label that had been partially torn from Len's crate. Someone had removed it more completely at some point, perhaps to examine it more closely, or simply in the process of handling the crate. She turned it over carefully, and her expression sharpened with interest. "Inspector, I believe you should see this." The reverse side of the label bore notations in blue pencil, a series of neat calculations, additions, and subtractions, with dates written in a particular format that Miss Marple recognized immediately. The style was characteristic of school registers, where dates were abbreviated and mathematical precision was paramount. Inspector Slack examined the writing, then compared it with entries in Miss Pratt's satchel, which had been set aside as evidence. The match was unmistakable. The same hand had written both sets of figures. The same blue pencil had been employed, and even the particular way certain numbers were formed, the 7s crossed, and the ones given small feet, was identical. "She used the back of this label for calculations," Slack observed, "probably figuring out how much blackmail money she would have to pay over time. Then tore it off the crate to eliminate the evidence of where the dry ice had come from originally. But Miss Marple had found something else. In Miss Pratt's satchel, carefully folded between the pages of a textbook on natural sciences, was the piece of waxed card that had been used as a baffle. It had been cut to precise dimensions, matching the grill beneath seat 7B exactly, and one side showed the greasy residue that had transferred to Miss Pratt's gloves. "She kept it," Lady Bantry said, astonished. "Why on earth would she keep the very thing that proved her guilt?" "Because she had nowhere to dispose of it," Miss Marple replied. "She could not throw it from the coach window without attracting attention, and once Mr. Bellamy was found dead, she had no opportunity to remove it discreetly, so she folded it away, perhaps hoping to dispose of it later when the commotion had died down." Inspector Slack had also discovered the upper label that had been applied to the crate at market basing. Comparing the handwriting on this with Miss Pratt's other writing samples confirmed what Miss Marple had already suspected. The schoolmistress had relabeled the crate herself, changing the destination and delivery time to make it appear that Len was simply returning an empty box rather than transporting refrigerated contents. This is what convinced Len that the crate was empty, Slack said. If it had still borne the Benham fish label with warnings about refrigerants, he would have checked inside more carefully. But with a fresh market basing label indicating empty return goods, he had no reason to question it. Len nodded slowly. That's right, sir. I just assumed it was ready to go back to the depot. Never thought to look inside proper-like. Miss Marple had returned her attention to the satchel, carefully examining its contents with Inspector Slack's permission. Among the textbooks and papers was a slim volume on chemistry, with several pages marked. One section dealt specifically with carbon dioxide, its properties, its density relative to air, and its behavior in enclosed spaces. She studied it thoroughly, Miss Marple observed. This was not an impulse born of desperate emotion. She planned every detail, understanding the science completely before she acted. Vera Bland spoke up hesitantly. But, Inspector, when did she actually place the dry ice under the seat? We were all watching at various times. The critical moment was when she moved the crate, Miss Marple explained. She pushed it with her foot, as she said. But what no one noticed was that she had already placed the block of ice inside it. The brown paper parcel you saw her carrying when she boarded, the one she claimed not to have, was wrapped around the ice. When she moved the crate, she used the motion to slide both crate and ice into position, then removed the paper wrapping and tucked it into her satchel. And the baffle? Slack prompted. Placed earlier, when she adjusted the ventilation panel above Mr. Bellamy's seat. She complained of drafts and condensation, which gave her an excuse to move about the coach. While appearing to open the top vent, she knelt briefly and slipped the waxed card behind the floor grill. It took only seconds, and everyone's attention was on her, hands working at the ceiling. Level, not at the floor. Inspector Slack assembled the evidence. Systematically, the torn label with its incriminating calculations, the waxed card baffle with its greasy residue, the chemistry textbook with its marked pages, and the testimony from Benham Fish confirming the purchase and the specific questions asked. It's a complete case, he said with satisfaction. Method, opportunity, and motive, all established beyond doubt. Miss Pratt, you understand that these items will be presented as evidence at your trial? Miss Pratt, who'd been sitting quietly throughout this final reconstruction, nodded. Her earlier composure had returned, though it seemed more fragile now, a shell that might crack at any moment. I understand, Inspector. I have no intention of denying what I've done. The evidence speaks clearly enough, and I'm not so foolish as to imagine I can escape the consequences. She looked around at the other passengers, her gaze lingering on each face. I am sorry that you were all caught up in this. That was never my intention. I simply wanted to be free of Mr. Bellamy's grip, and I saw no other way forward. It seems I lacked imagination as well as courage. Miss Marple regarded her with that peculiar mixture of sympathy and sadness that came from understanding human weakness all too well. We all lack something when we are frightened enough, she said quietly. But taking a life is never the answer, no matter how trapped we feel. There is always another path if we have the wisdom to seek it and the courage to take it. The wind had finally begun to ease, and the sun broke through the clouds, for the first time that day, casting long shadows across the frost-covered landscape. It is time, Inspector Slack announced, for everyone to go their separate ways. Chapter 10. Frost Coach, Dry Ice, Grill, and the Passenger Who Shifted the Cold. The sun had climbed higher by the time Inspector Slack declared himself satisfied with the evidence and released the passengers to continue their interrupted journeys. A replacement coach had been summoned from Market Basing, and most of the travelers were eager to depart, eager to put distance between themselves and the morning's grim events. But before they dispersed, Miss Marple requested one final gathering. She stood near the front of the original coach, which remained cordoned as evidence, and addressed the small assembly with her usual quiet authority. "I should like, if I may, to summarize what occurred this morning, not for dramatic effect, but because I believe it important that we all understand precisely how this tragedy unfolded. Knowledge, after all, is the best defense against deception." Inspector Slack nodded his approval, though he looked as if he would have preferred to conduct this final explanation himself. Dr. Haydock leaned against the side of the coach, his medical bag at his feet. Lady Bantry stood close to her friend, while the remaining passengers formed a semicircle in the frost-brittle grass. Miss Marple began, with the method, as that was the most remarkable aspect of the crime. Horace Bellamy died, not from poison, nor from violence, nor from any conventional means. He died from breathing carbon dioxide gas, which had been deliberately introduced beneath his seat in the form of dry ice. The solid sublimed directly to gas, and because that gas is heavier than ordinary air, it pooled at floor level around his ankles and feet. As he sat low in his seat, with his collar buttoned against the cold, he gradually inhaled more and more carbon dioxide until he lost consciousness, and eventually ceased breathing altogether. She gestured toward the coach interior. The method required several elements to work effectively. First, a source of carbon dioxide, which Miss Pratt obtained from Benham fish in the form of 2 blocks of dry ice. Second, a means of keeping the gas concentrated at floor level, which she achieved by blocking the heating grill with a waxed card baffle. This prevented any warm air from rising through and dispersing the carbon dioxide cloud. Third, an opportunity to place the ice without detection, which presented itself when Len's crate arrived and could be used as a container. Mr. Wilkes, who had been listening with the fascinated horror of a man realizing how his vehicle had been used as a murder weapon, spoke up. "But surely someone would have noticed the cold, the smell, something." "Carbon dioxide is odorless," Dr. Haydock explained, and the coach was already cold due to the malfunctioning heater. The extreme cold near the floor simply seemed like more of the same problem. Only Miss Marple noticed the peculiar localized nature of it. Miss Marple continued, her voice steady and clear. The clues were subtle but telling. The white burn on the carpet where the dry ice rested directly against the fibers. The pale rim on Mr. Bellamy's trouser hem where the intense cold had frosted the wool. The spent match that would not burn because there was insufficient oxygen at floor level. The coin that rolled forward and stopped, as though encountering a puddle of heavier air. And the grill itself, which blew neither hot nor cold, but was actively frigid to the touch. She held up her fingers, ticking off each point. The crate bore 2 labels, one from Benham, fish, warning of refrigerant contents, and another from Market Basing, suggesting empty return goods. The lower label, when examined, showed Miss Pratt's handwriting and calculations on the reverse. The waxed card baffle, recovered from her satchel, matched the dimensions of the grill exactly, and bore the paraffin residue that transferred to her gloves. Her muff showed speckles of sublimed frost from handling the dry ice, and most damning, the fishmonger at Benham remembered her specific Questions about how carbon dioxide behaves in enclosed spaces. Inspector Slack took up the narrative, consulting his notebook. As to opportunity, Miss Pratt boarded at Market Basing, carrying a parcel wrapped in brown paper. This parcel contained the blocks of dry ice, already prepared for transport. When she moved Len's crate to tidy the aisle, she simultaneously positioned the ice inside it, beneath Mr. Bellamy's seat. Earlier, while adjusting the ventilation panel above, she had knelt briefly and placed the baffle behind the floor grill. The entire operation took no more than a few moments and attracted no particular attention. And the motive? Lady Bantry asked, though she already knew the answer. Blackmail, Miss Marple said simply. Horace Bellamy had discovered that Miss Pratt was conducting private tutoring without the required approval from her school board. It was a minor violation, perhaps, but one that could cost her position and her pension. Rather than report it immediately, he chose to extract regular payments to ensure his silence. Miss Pratt saw no end to this arrangement and decided that murder was preferable to a lifetime of paying. Tribute to her blackmailer, Miss Pratt herself had been, standing apart from the group, but now she spoke, her voice weary but composed. Miss Marple has stated everything correctly. I have nothing to add or subtract from her account. I planned it carefully, executed it as I had designed, and would have succeeded had not Miss Marple possessed such keen powers of observation. I underestimated how much those small details, the frost on fabric and the coin's peculiar behavior, would reveal. You underestimated the basic principle, Miss Marple said gently. That murder always leaves traces. However clever the method, however invisible the weapon, there are always signs for those who know how to look for them. Inspector Slack stepped forward, his manner formal now. Miss Celia Pratt, I am arresting you for the willful murder of Horace Bellamy. You will be taken to the station and charged accordingly. I must warn you that anything you say may be given in evidence. Miss Pratt submitted to the handcuffs with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout. As she was led toward the waiting police vehicle, she paused and looked back at Miss Marple. You said there were always other choices. Perhaps you were right, but I could not see them at the time, and now it is too late to discover them. It is always too late after the fact, Miss Marple replied. That is the tragedy of impulsive action born from sustained desperation. One builds to a moment where only a single path seems possible, and by the time one realizes there were other routes, the irreversible step has already been taken. The constable helped Miss Pratt into the vehicle, and it pulled away down the frost-rutted lane. The remaining passengers watched it go, then turned to their own departures with visible relief. Len Farrow approached Miss Marple shyly. Begging your pardon, miss, but I wanted to thank you. If not for your noticing those details, I might have been suspected myself, what with it being my crate and all. You were never a serious suspect, Len, Miss Marple assured him. You had no motive, and your movements were accounted for, but you're welcome nonetheless. Lady Bantry linked arms with her friend as they walked toward their own motor car. Well, Jane, another body and another solution. Inspector Slack will never admit it, but you've saved him considerable trouble. Inspector Slack is quite capable in his way, Miss Marple said mildly. He would have reached the same conclusions eventually. I merely hastened the process by noticing a few small things. A white burn on carpet, a coin that wouldn't roll properly, and a thermos lid with a frost ring, Lady Bantry recited. Hardly small things when they add up to murder. They reached the car, and Miss Marple settled herself in the passenger seat with a small sigh. Her knitting bag sat in her lap, the needles and yarn undisturbed since early morning. You know, Dolly, I believe I shall take the Tenwa coach in future when I must go to London, one with a proper fire and reliable heating, and I shall insist that all parcels remain in their designated places, visible, and accounted for. Lady Bantry laughed as she started the engine. A wise policy, though, knowing you, Jane, you'll probably stumble over another mystery before the week is out. I sincerely hope not, Miss Marple said. One frozen murder per winter is quite sufficient. As they drove away from the lay-by, the frost was beginning to melt at last under the strengthening sun. The hedges would soon lose their crystalline coating, the fields would thaw, and the frost coach would return to its ordinary routine of carrying ordinary passengers through ordinary mornings. But Miss Marple would remember this particular journey and the lesson it taught about how knowledge and desperation could combine to create something deadly. She would remember the schoolmistress who had chosen murder over submission, and the collector of debts who had pushed someone past endurance, and she would remember that even the coldest crimes left warm traces for those patient enough to find them.